This is Module 4, Language Development. In this module, we will talk about modes of communication, components of language, what are the 5 components of language. We'll discuss theories of language acquisition. Then we'll go through the periods of language development, birth, all the way up until school age. I encourage you to read Chapter 4 in your book and take notes as you go along in this lecture. In order to fully understand language development, let's take a look at 3 modes of communication: gesture, oral language, and written language. Gesture includes eye movement, such as showing expression with your eyes or looking at an object that you're talking about or making eye contact with someone. Hand movement includes pointing or showing expression with your hands while telling a story. It also can include sign language. Oral language is verbalizations and spoken language. And then written language is using the alphabet to make words, also sentences and paragraphs. It's that orthographic representation of language. You see written language everywhere, on signs, out when you're driving, in hallways, in books, in emails, and texts, and notes, and recipes. Written language is everywhere. It's important for you to note that oral language significantly affects written language. Research indicates that children with strong oral language skills will most likely have strong written skills and strong reading skills. So, oral language can impact literacy. The components of language include semantics, phonology, morphology, syntax, and pragmatics. Whenever we are looking at the typical development of language or impaired language, we are looking at these 5 areas. The content of our language is described as semantics, or our semantic development. That means our vocabulary, or understanding and production of words. The form of our language is divided into 3 parts: phonology, which we've talked about a little bit, the sounds that make up words. Then there's morphology, which includes words and those inflections that attach to words, such as plurals or past tense or passive progressive. Then there's syntax, that is word order, or what order our words go in to make sentences. Are we making a declarative statement or are we making a question? And then finally is use of language, and those are our pragmatic skills. Those are our social skills, our ability to stay on topic or know when to change the subject or know when to take a turn appropriately and not interrupt. When talking about language, we're talking about the content, the form, and the use. There are 2 main theories of language development: the nurturist versus the naturist. Nurturists believe that children are born knowing nothing of language, that language is acquired. And the naturists believed that children are born with an innate ability to learn linguistic concepts. Let's take a look first at the nurturists. So they think that children know nothing of language and it all must come from the outside. B.F. Skinner was one of the popular nurturists. If you've taken psychology courses, you've probably heard the term operant conditioning. This comes from B.F. Skinner. He believed in reinforcement, and that as children made sounds it was reinforced by the parent, they would repeat those sounds. For example, if a child said ba 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 and the mother brought the child the bottle, the child was reinforced by making that sound, so then he would repeat it again and again, thus becoming a word and developing language. Vygotsky believed that language was acquired through social interactions, as the child's diaper was being changed or bathed, that he would acquire language through the parent saying things like, I'm changing your diaper, I'm washing you, you are a good boy. That's the way the child is learning language. Similarly, Tomasello proposed that social nature of language serves as a motivator for children to learn. So children learn language because they attend to their caregivers and realize that there's intention associated with those interactions. And then they begin to imitate those. And then finally, Piaget hypothesized that language was a secondary behavior to cognitive development. So according to his theory, children could perceive and organize their experiences into meaningful units of information, and then eventually these units would become language. The naturists, as I stated earlier, believe that there's an innate ability to learn language. Noam Chomsky was one of the main researchers behind this theory. He believed that children were born with this abstract mechanism called the LAD, or the language acquisition device. This LAD is an area in the brain that allow children to acquire language at a rapid pace and to be creative in their sentence constructions. According to Chomsky, children are pre-wired with a basic set of linguistic skills. Gleitman, who was also considered a naturist, believes that children are born with a basic understanding of word categories such as nouns and verbs. She referred to this ability as syntactic bootstrapping. So children have a general understanding of an action verb, and then when they hear that verb in a sentence, they are able to determine the meaning based on how it is used. And finally, Pinker, another naturist, believed that children use their inborn conceptual knowledge to create grammatical categories. This is known as semantic bootstrapping. So, for example, a child has a general idea of what an object is and what an action is, and they use that knowledge to understand that a novel word functions as a corresponding noun or verb. Both of these theories have contributed to our understanding of language development. So it is likely that it's a combination of both of these theories of why language is developed in young children. As we move into the section of periods of language development, I want to encourage you to read Chapter 4 in your book. Your book does a really good job of breaking language down by each component and telling what a typically developing child should be doing at each stage. One of the first things that we talk about when we talk about language development is perception. I mentioned perception in Module 3 when we were speaking of speech sound development. Pages 78 and 79 in the book explain these two research studies in more depth: the high amplitude sucking method and the head turn paradigm. The high amplitude sucking method is how we know that newborns are able to perceive the difference in sound. So, for example, a newborn would be given a high pressure pacifier And this pressure-sensitive pacifier is measuring their rate of sucking. So a sound would be introduced, or a syllable string, such as ba 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 ba. And when the infant first hears the sound, they're sucking at a much faster rate than when they become accustomed to the sound. So their rate would decrease after a certain time. So then the researcher introduced another sound, like da 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 da, and then the rate would increase again, showing that the infant is perceiving differences in sound. Another perception procedure that's introduced or has been introduced when children are about 6 months or old enough to hold their head up is the head turn paradigm. So this is where operant conditioning is used to train or teach children to look in the direction of a toy that lights up, or when a new novel stimulus is introduced. So once a child has been conditioned to respond to the toy, the experimenter plays a continuous string of syllables, and when they become more accustomed to the syllable string, the toy no longer has the attention of the child. So then the experiment introduces a new string of syllables. If the infant perceives a difference between the new and the old syllable string, then they will look at the toy, because the toy is reinforcing. But through these studies, we know that all children have the ability to perceive sound between English language as well as sounds used in other languages. But we also know at some point, through repeated exposure to their native language, children suppress the ability to perceive differences in other languages. Usually at about 9 months, lose that ability to know the difference between other languages. So why does this happen? One factor may be that the children become accustomed to their ambient language, that native language that's spoken in the home. Another important factor is the parent's use of child-directed speech, and it may assist those infants in learning their language. Child-directed speech occurs when caregivers give a reduced rate, increased pitch variation, long pauses between utterances, and frequent repetition of utterances when interacting with infants. You've heard mothers or parents speak to their infants in this manner. They attend for long periods of time when caregivers use child-directed speech in comparison to adult-directed speech. So you've heard parents say, "Hey, what are you doing? Look." So that's that child-directed speech. It maintains the child's attention. So that's one reason we believe that children are acquiring that ambient language, or their first language, native language. Parents also use what's called joint reference to help children learn new words. Joint reference occurs when caregiver labels an object or action when both the caregiver and the child are attending to that object or action. Let's talk about periods of language development. I want to remind you to be sure to read Chapter 4 in your book, especially the section on periods of language development starting on page 77, as the book does a very good job of giving you examples of what children are doing at certain ages. I'm going to review them here, but I'm going to be pretty general in my explanation. The pre-linguistic period, which is birth to 12 months, is a time when children are using their senses to learn language. They use vision, touch, hearing, smell, taste. We've talked about this stage as being the cooing and gooing, babbling stage. There's not really any expressive vocabulary. The receptive vocabulary is increasing much faster than expressive. So we know by 12 months children can understand up to about 50 words. We know that children can perceive the difference in sound. We know that they perceive differences in their own language and are beginning to make sense of their native language or the language that's spoken most frequently in their home. We know that children are beginning to use what's called illocutionary acts. So it's this primitive act of labeling, requesting, refusing, calling attention, and repeating. So they're not using verbalizations, but they may be using vocalizations or gestures to get things. So they might be reaching their arms up or pointing to something. They may be refusing something by turning their head or closing their mouth. They can call attention by making a loud squeal or vocalization. And then also you've probably seen infants do this pitch variation where they may play kind of a game with you where you're saying, ah, and then they may say, ah, back to you. So they kind of start this repeating variations of sounds. The next stage of development, which is the second year of life from 12 to 24 months, is when children begin to really build their language skills, especially in the areas of semantics and pragmatics. Receptive language or vocabulary has increased to around 500 words, and they're producing about 250 words by their second birthday. So they've gone from like about one word at 12 months to all the way to about 250 by their second birthday. We know that children are understanding more than they're producing. So receptive vocabulary, we always look at that as coming first before expressive. So we know children are understanding before they're producing. And that skill develops much faster than expressive vocabulary. Children begin to combine words in their expressive vocabulary, forming by their second birthday, forming like 2-word combinations. So we always think of at 1 year, it's usually 1-word utterances. At 2 years is 2-word utterances. At 3 is 3-word utterances. Then at 24 to 36 months, we know that children's receptive vocabulary is at about 900 words. Something that I forgot to mention, the 12 to 24 month stage, is those pre-literacy skills. Children can look at pictures. Parents might start introducing books to children where they can start kind of following along, knowing that we're going left to right. They turning the book the right way, turning pages. We know that children can begin to understand what to do with a book. They may not know what is happening in the book, but they know that they're attending to a picture, or we know that they can start all that left to right sequence of words. So back to 24 to 36 months, that receptive vocabulary or understanding is at about 900 words. And those pre-literacy skills, they really are looking at the books. They may be pointing to pictures as the parents read the story. They may have favorite stories. They begin to recognize some words. They pretend to read, maybe. They demonstrate by pointing and naming pictures. They start to recognize signs of restaurants. They know which restaurants are their favorites by noticing maybe the big golden arches of the McDonald's, and they might start to begin to know that that's the M. So we know that these pre-literacy skills are starting very young. Another skill that's happening from 24 to 36 months is something that's called fast mapping. And we know that this skill involves a vocabulary spurt. So they're able to start producing new word after new word after only hearing it one or two times. They begin to use some semantic relationships. Remember, semantics is meaning. For example, they start to put words together to mean recurrence or rejection. Recurrence would be like more juice. Rejection would be no ball. Children may overextend or underextend words during this stage of development. For example, overextending is when a child may use the word mama for every female that they see. Or they may underextend by knowing that their dog is doggy, but thinking that that doggy only refers to their dog, and it's not all the dogs in the world or all the dogs they see in the neighborhood. At 2, we also know that morphology is becoming more advanced. Morphology refers to that smallest unit of meaning. So morphemes can stand alone or they can be bound. So, for example, the word park, like I'm going to park my car, is one morpheme. But then if I said I parked my car with that ed, that's two morphemes. So I have the freestanding morpheme of park, and then I have the bound morpheme, that ed, that I attach to it, and it becomes parked. So I have two morphemes. So there is a series of morphemes that are developed, and they're listed on page 83. Children at about 2 to 3 start to learn those first two morphemes, such as putting the ing or putting the plural s on the end of words. They may start understanding the preposition in, and then as they get older, they start to learn all 14 grammatical morphemes. In order to measure syntactic and morphological development, we calculate something called the MLU, or the mean length of utterance. And you do that in a language sample. You'll talk more about that in your normal language development classes. Now let's talk about ages 3 to 5. These are called the preschool years. Syntactic development really happens during this age. Nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, prepositions, and pronouns are all used. Children are forming sentences and they're telling stories. Thousands of words, receptively and expressively, are being used. Receptive still is more advanced than expressive. Preschoolers are using all 14 grammatical morphemes by the time they are 5. And one very important skill that's being developed during the preschool years is phonological development. We've talked a little bit about phonological awareness, but I'm going to remind you that it's a complex linguistic skill where children become aware that sentences are made up of words, and words are made up of syllables, and syllables are made up of sounds or phonemes. They begin to show awareness that words sound alike, like they rhyme. They start to understand that you can blend sounds together, or this sound may have an ending sound and this sound doesn't. They begin to understand structure, narrative structure, manipulating sounds, predicting in stories, maybe know what's going to come next when the teacher or parent is telling a story. They know that it's not just by the pictures. They understand that the words and the text really mean something. They can point along to the words as someone is reading. They start to develop reading skills, being able to identify some sight words, and actually sounding out some words. Phonological development, how well those skills are, really helps determine how well children are going to read. So who have good phonological awareness abilities typically become really good at reading. So that's why we know to start very early on that phonological development. Then children enter into what we call the school age. That's 5 years plus, so kindergarten on up. And oral language continues to progress and expand in all 5 areas of language. Remember, those 5 areas are phonology, semantics, syntax, morphology, and pragmatics. Children have 5,000 to 10,000 words expressively now. They're using a lot of words. Children begin to use reading as a way to improve their oral language. So reading, we know, greatly impacts vocabulary. School-age children begin to use prefixes and suffixes, antonyms and synonyms, homonyms. They begin to understand figurative language, metaphors, similes, idioms. They begin to understand humor. Much more sophisticated language development happens at this age. And socially, making friends, maintaining those relationships, knowing how to be appropriate in social situations is all developing during these school age years.